I'm going to show you how to hold shakuhachi of various lengths. So we're going to start with a 1.8 with standard inline holds. That means that they're straight in line with one another on the front of the flute. Then I'll be showing you a larger shakuhachi at 2.4, which is a bass length shakuhachi. That one has slightly offset holes for ergonomics. That means that the holes are rotated slightly off center on the horizontal axis to help improve ergonomics. In other words, so that you can hold them more naturally. Then I have a 2.7 that has inline holes. Then I have a 2.7 that also has offset holes. To hold a 1.8, again, you want your middle fingers to be in a natural neutral position in between the holes so that your other two fingers easily and naturally fall on the holes. So in other words, the middle finger isn't too high or too low, which will result in you having to reach with one or the other fingers to get to the finger hole. The fingers are going to be very natural. It's sort of like holding a cup. You can see my hand here has a natural arch to the fingers. So I'm not doing like this, and I'm not doing like this. My hand is very natural. So I've noticed guitar players often will want to do this when they come to their first lesson for shakuhachi. So if that's you, try to relax your fingers out like this. So it's very natural. And this enables you to move very fluidly on the shakuhachi. Now, one thing that prevents people from doing this is they don't know that it's okay to cover finger holes with another portion of the finger other than the tip. So notice even on 1.8, my tip is covering for this one. However, up here, I'm covering just below my final or third knuckle on this hole. And up here, kind of similar, I'm covering here. Although sometimes I will use my tip on the hole like this. Now on a smaller shakuhachi, if you have big hands, you can sometimes get away with doing something that's a little unideal. Especially if you have the type of body that doesn't really experience repetitive strain injuries as readily as others. Now when we increase the size of the shakuhachi, we're going to, of course, run into a bit more challenges. Now, one of the main things we want to be focusing on is maintaining what's called a neutral wrist position, which I talked a bit more about in a previous video. But you make a fist, engaging both muscles, or the muscles on both sides of the forearm. And this is a healthy wrist position that prevents things like carpal tunnel from developing. So when you hold the shakuhachi, you can make a fist and then gently relax it out and float it over the shakuhachi. So this can help ingrain the muscle memory so that you don't want to come in like this or like this on the shakuhachi. Another thing that helps facilitate this is that you're not moving the arms up like this or pinning them to your sides, so you have a natural spacing of the arms or under the arms. Some people find it useful to imagine that there's a small ball that they're holding underneath their armpit, so it's a small amount of space there. And it forms kind of a triangle, as you can see. So in this position, with my thumb also in a natural position, which for me is underneath the index finger, so I'm not making an effort to move my thumb either which way, just like that. The flute is sort of leveraged in, and it can balance on our chin if our anatomy allows for it. Yours might not. Now, regardless if it does, leaning forward, as we talked about also in a previous video, is generally just bad for your posture, and you'll generally have to start gripping the shakuhachi more and more with that bottom hand the more forward you find yourself leaning. So in general, it's good to have that upright meditative posture so that hopefully your anatomy will allow for you to balance the flute on your chin like this. Now it rolled off because my middle finger, I took it off. So the middle finger's function is especially to keep the shakuhachi from rolling like this. So if I take that all-important bottom middle finger off, but I still have that thumb, but I leave my top middle finger on, you can see it's not rolling, it's just balancing. And I'm not pressing down with that middle finger. It's very lightly touching. Well, if you can see here, I'm trying to use the very bare minimum amount, just the very tip of my finger, so it doesn't roll. So your middle fingers, especially the top one, are just resting on the shakuhachi. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the thumb, which can be a bit tricky for people because our thumbs, as I've seen through teaching over the years, vary quite a bit. So some thumbs are relatively straight, some, like mine, you can bend like this, and yet other thumbs can be twisted due to whatever occupation is. So we can run into a lot of challenges with our thumbs. So different ways that people tend to cover the thumb hole, either straight like this, or with the hand at a slight angle, or like me with the thumb bent a little, or some people still yet covering kind of like this with that portion there using the knuckle, particularly on larger shakuhachi where they want to get the hand in closer for improved ergonomics. So with the thumb, the main thing is that you want to have a position that allows, again, for that top hand wrist to be what's called neutral, and for your fingers to be as natural as possible. So I'm just going to play a bit so you can see the movement and flow of my fingers with all of these things applied. So I'm moving my fingers quickly so you can see the ease of motion. So it's similar to how some people might finger drum or rap on something with their fingers. Granted, some people might use their fingertips. We'll ignore them. Just imagine that everybody does it like this. So it's something like this where it's very fluid and natural. It's moving from the first knuckle as opposed to moving from these knuckles. Now before I move on to a larger shakuhachi, I want to talk about the pinkies. So there's a tendency for students to place the pinkies, one or the other or both, under the shakuhachi. This is not good. It's not necessary, and it inhibits a very important motion, and that is of the ring fingers. So these two fingers, as you can tell, they're connected and want to move together. And by pinning the pinkies, we really inhibit the movement of those ring fingers. Now those ring fingers are key for a shakuhachi technique involved in performing what's called meri. Meri is flattening a note, and it involves doing what's called some finger shading in English. And basically we want to often roll the finger hole open. Notice I say roll and not slide. So we're not sliding the finger, rather we're doing a rolling motion like this to uncover a small amount of it to achieve a flatter, darker note. Now if the pinkies are floating, we can roll fairly easily, and you can see my pinkies wanting to move with that motion. Whereas if I pin them, they're inhibiting that motion. So that's very important. Now reasons people might be trying to place their pinkies underneath the flute is that they're in general just kind of trying to really grip the flute too much. So in lessons I often look for if there's a ring underneath the finger, which means they're pressing too much, or that the fingernail is turning white, which means that they're pressing so hard that it's changing from a natural color to sort of the pale color as they're presumably pushing the blood out of their fingertips. So that's something we don't want to do. Now, naturally, when we're playing shakuhachi, our awareness is usually very preoccupied with a number of things, especially if we're playing for our teacher or if we're performing. As you can imagine, your awareness gets pulled in many directions. So what I encourage my students and for everybody is to periodically put your awareness, put your attention or your focus on what your body's doing. And if we make a habit of doing this, or if we set aside time in our practice to do this, we'll hopefully develop the muscle memory where it's automatic. So when it's automatic, you don't have to think about all these things at all. They just happen. Unless maybe you pick up a new instrument that presents new challenges, such as a larger shakuhachi, then you might have to think about how to approach this new instrument safely. Now let's look at a slightly larger shakuhachi. This is a 2.4, and I apologize for the appearance of it. This is one of my gauge flutes, so I test things on this flute. So try not to be distracted by some of this stuff. But you can see compared to a 1.8, it's a considerable amount larger. The finger spacing isn't too different, if I can wheel these, on the bottom two holes, but at the top two holes, the finger spacing is quite a bit more of a stretch on the 2.4. So granted, with your anatomy and with whatever instrument you're playing, it's going to vary a lot. We have a lot of variables here. But let's just see how I approach this particular shakuhachi. Now again, this one has offset finger holes for ergonomics. They're rotated horizontally for a right hand on bottom player, and this is to ideally help maintain a neutral wrist position and just overall healthy posture. So more importantly, let's kind of see where my fingers lie, or rather where the holes are covered by my fingers, as opposed to anything too specific, since again, I have large hands and all those other variables that will shift and change depending on the situation. So with this one, you can see that, as you might expect, the fingertip is covering the bottom hole, but with the top hole, I'm actually covering below the second knuckle. Now notice that my hand is coming a lot closer. On the 1.8, it was out here. I'm going to pull the flute away so I'm not talking into the shakuhachi. Apologies for that. So when you bring your hand in here, this has been called the piper's grip, in reference to how bagpipe players hold the bagpipe. So that grip allows you to get in closer and to have a bit more of an ergonomic situation. So I'm trying again to maintain that neutral wrist position. And I'm having to supinate my hand a little bit. And that can put stress on this area, which if it gets injured or inflamed, that's known as a golfer's elbow. And it can sort of tend to want to bring my shoulder around as well, which, as we talked about in a previous video, we want to avoid rounding out our shoulders. And generally, we also want to avoid doing motions like this that'll put stress on one part of the forearm more so than sharing that load with the rest of the forearm and the shoulder and so on. So everything is connected, as you can see. So looking at the top hand, again, the tip here, and here I'm covering just above that second knuckle. With the thumb, I'm actually covering with this edge here of my thumb so that I can presumably maintain a more neutral wrist position. I'm just playing a few notes to see what my muscle memory does and how things kind of fall into place. So notice my arms, again, aren't pinned to my sides and they're not flared out. So I have that comfortable amount of space that allows my wrist to stay as neutral as possible. Again, I'm able to balance. I'm able to balance the flute on the chin, especially in this position, gives some added stability against the rolling that I talked about previously. So I'm able to take my middle fingers off to demonstrate that it's balancing on the chin. Pinkies are up and floating, so I can do the meri shading. And overall, it still feels pretty comfortable for me. Now that might not be the case for you if you have smaller hands, so just always check in to make sure that you can maintain those neutral wrist positions and a natural hand shape. Now let's take a look at a larger shakuhachi, a 2.7 with offset finger holes. This one's offset for a left hand on bottom player. This is another gauge flute of mine. So just as a size reference, you can see the difference between this 2.7 and this 2.4, 2.3 and a half size shakuhachi. So with this one, with the offset holes, you can actually see that my hand position is similar to what it was with the 2.4. And that's partly thanks to offsetting the holes. I actually sensed my bottom hand trying to squeeze and grip. That's something to be mindful of with the piper's grip, is that you are able to sort of squeeze a bit more with this position. So be mindful of that. Try not to do that, of course. But all in all, this is also very similar to 2.4. I'm covering that second hole just below that second knuckle. Now, with a longer shakuhachi, you're of course going to increase the difficulty because the arm is going to have to be further extended. This means that the shakuhachi is going to feel heavier and gravity is going to be pulling you down more. So because of that, with larger shakuhachi, or especially thicker, heavier shakuhachi, we have to think more about posture. We have to work on our posture, develop strength and endurance so that we can play these flutes healthily and avoid injury. So with a larger shakuhachi, I am perhaps pronated a bit more, rotated like this with the bottom hand. So I might be putting more pressure or creating more tension here. So then it's even more important that I'm making sure that my shoulder blades, or what's called the scapula, the muscles that act on those bones, are engaged and kind of pulling my scapula a bit down and in towards the rib cage, so securing it rather than letting it round and flare like this. So like this. For the last shakuhachi, we'll be looking at another base 2.7, but this one has inline finger holes. So the way I'm holding it, it's not quite different. Now that's thanks to my larger size hands. For your particular anatomy, especially if you have smaller size hands, this might not be the case. But all in all, this is very comfortable for me. So let's see how I play this instrument without thinking about it. So I'm able to play very naturally. My muscle memory, my training in other words, can just take over. I don't have to think about these things. And actually, as my shoulder starts to round out, my instinct pulls it back into place. So it's kind of like self-correcting. Now to get to that point, before your body can sort of make these corrections on its own and play healthily and safely, you have to often put some thought into it and take some time and shift your awareness while you're playing to your body, and specifically things like, are my wrists neutral? Am I pinning my arms like this or flaring them out? And notice how these things take more effort. So we're working towards more effortless playing, but often we put in too much effort. We squeeze too tightly with our fingers, we curl them up, or we press our arms to our sides, or we flare them out. And it doesn't have to be dramatic amount, it can be even just a little bit, but that can accrue over time into discomfort and injury, or it could just keep us from reaching our full potential with shakuhachi. So I hope this video helps you to play shakuhachi more healthily and safely.